Hello, everyone. I am Alex Lim, your host, and welcome to AuthorStory, the home of authors and stories that matter. This episode's featured guest is Dr. Jim Taylor, author of How to Survive and Thrive When Bad Things Happen, 9 Steps to Cultivating an Opportunity Mindset in a Crisis. So, Dr. Taylor, welcome to AuthorStory. Thank you very much for being with us.
Happy to be here, Alex. Thanks so much.
All right, you're welcome. Well, first off, your background. Well, maybe for starters, more specifically, the path that enabled you to become the successful coach you presently are. It all started when you were a 4 foot 9 inch, quote unquote, 90-pound wimp who wanted to achieve something big, wasn't it?
That's sort of the case. I didn't use the word wimp, but I probably was at the time.
Okay, so how did that goal lead you to the breakthroughs that have enabled you to essentially become the person that you are today?
Well, it's quite interesting because before I was 16, I was an underachiever.
Mm.
I was both athletically, academically. I didn't do very well. I didn't try very hard. I wasn't motivated. I basically sabotaged my own efforts.
Uh-huh.
But I had a passion for alpine ski racing, which I'm not sure there's much skiing in the Philippines, but I had a passion for ski racing. As misguided as it seemed at the time, I wanted to be one of the best ski racers in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to a private school in Vermont on the east coast of the U.S. Just for ski racers.
Right.
Where some of the best ski racers trained. And for the first couple of years, again, I was unmotivated. I was lazy. I didn't work very hard. And for a guy that small, that didn't work.
Right.
And then one summer, I had an epiphany, and I don't know where it came from, but I just realized that if I was going to be the best I could be, then I had to start working hard in everything, not just athletically, but also academically.
Mm-hmm.
Since then, a switch flipped,
Mm-hmm.
and I became this hyper-driven, hyper-motivated, super intense fellow.
Right.
And it drove me to a degree of success as a ski racer. I didn't become the best in the world, didn't
Mm-hmm.
achieve that goal, but I competed internationally,
Mm-hmm.
and I made it much farther than anybody thought I would.
Mm-hmm.
And that led me to college, Middlebury College in Vermont also,
Mm-hmm.
and I took a psychology class.
Mm-hmm.
And the way I put it is that psychology, I didn't choose psychology, it chose me.
Uh-huh.
I just resonated with it, and there was no other, I had a lot of opportunities. I could have gone into business, I could have been a
Right.
physician, but I was drawn to psychology. And so I decided to pursue a career in psychology. I received my PhD from the University of Colorado in Boulder,
Mm-hmm.
and ever since then, I've continued on this path of trying to help people perform the best they could and deal with challenges that they're faced in their life.
Right. And I mean, you've covered a lot of ground. I mean, you mentioned you're a second Dan black belter. You've conducted thousands of well, hundreds, maybe over 1,000 workshops, and you've written 17 books and over 1,000 articles. So it's paid off, I guess.
Well, one could argue that it's paid off, I suppose, but really that's never what's driven me. I've never been driven
Uh-huh.
by fame, haven't been driven by money. It's more just my passion.
Uh-huh.
And just with my writing, I can't not write
Mm-hmm.
because writing is a part of my being.
Mm-hmm.
If I get an idea, for me to not write about it is to not be true to myself, and not to not be authentic.
Mm-hmm.
And so my career has always been driven by generating new ideas,
Mm-hmm.
creating, innovating,
Mm-hmm.
and sharing ideas with people.
Right, okay. And I mean, you wouldn't have become successful as you have become without some sort of, I don't know how to put it, some sort of philosophy or some sort of framework that enables you to do these things. Is this so? Do you have such a framework or philosophy?
It's a very interesting question. I wouldn't say I have a fully articulated philosophy
Okay.
in terms of my writing, in terms of my expression. I
Mm-hmm.
think professionally, I do, and that philosophy is one of ownership,
Mm-hmm.
that taking responsibility for your life.
Mm-hmm.
Another is following your passions,
Mm-hmm.
and also just being willing to do the hard work.
Mm-hmm.
Because the fact is, these days everybody thinks because of the internet that you can have instant success. You get on social media and you're a star. You do a
Right.
podcast in the top 10,
Right.
and realistically, that's just not the way the world works. Very few people reach that level, and I
Mm-hmm.
certainly haven't. I mean, I'm well known in my field, and I think I've made some nice contributions to the world,
Right.
but I'm not famous by any means, and I'm not wealthy. I make a very nice living. I support my family, but again, I've never been driven by those things, and I
Mm-hmm.
think all if you are driven by fame, fortune, you might achieve those, although statistically you probably won't. But
Mm-hmm.
there's probably not gonna be a lot of passion, a lot of joy, a lot of
Mm-hmm.
meaning. Those things can come from
All right.
passion, joy, meaning, but they're not going to lead it. They're going to follow.
Uh-huh. All right. Okay, that's an interesting viewpoint. Definitely, it's different from what people commonly think of. Like being famous and all that. So, all right. All right. So let's get on to the subject. First off, let's start with the brass tacks. Crisis. All right. The word crisis, it can mean many things to many people, but what is the essential definition of a crisis?
Yeah, sure. So Alex, everybody has an intuitive sense of a crisis,
All
but
right.
I'm a word guy, as you know from my writing,
Mm-hmm.
in that I believe in the power of words. And that
Mm-hmm.
it's really important that two things. One, the words we use are highly descriptive of what we're trying to communicate, and
Mm-hmm.
also that we have a shared understanding. Because in this world, there's so much misunderstanding because we misinterpret or we have different understandings of what words mean.
Mm-hmm.
So let me throw out a few ideas about how I define a crisis, so we can be in the same place.
Okay.
So I define a crisis as a situation or event that arises suddenly,
Mm-hmm.
that disrupts lives and threatens the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And one other thing about it is that they also often have long-term and harmful consequences to individuals and groups. Now,
Mm-hmm.
clearly, the COVID crisis speaks to that in spades.
Right.
And all of important qualities of a crisis include they're unexpected. Certainly, nobody expected the pandemic to hit.
Mm-hmm.
They create instability. This is a big one because people don't like instability. It's disrupted our world for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, from a psychological perspective, there are three things that human beings really don't like.
Mm-hmm.
One is unfamiliarity,
Mm-hmm.
two is unpredictability,
Mm-hmm.
and three is uncontrollability.
Mm-hmm.
And these come about as a function of from evolution. So when we were cave people on the Serengeti 250,000 years ago, when we first became official human beings, Homo sapiens,
Right.
we're driven by one fundamental need, and that's to survive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll return to that in a second. So another key quality of a crisis is it's often experienced as trauma. And so
Mm-hmm.
clearly the COVID crisis is having physical health crises, psychological, social. But what's also interesting, Alex, that's really challenging is that we don't just have one crisis. We are experiencing what I call a perfect storm of crises. And I wrote a blog post about this a few months ago,
Mm-hmm.
that we are in unprecedented times in terms of crises. We've
Mm-hmm.
had health crises before. We've had the economic crises like the Great Recession and the Great Depression.
Right.
But we haven't had a health crisis, an individual health crisis, a global health crisis,
Right.
a personal financial crisis for many people who've lost their jobs,
Mm-hmm.
a global economic crisis.
Mm-hmm.
We are also have had a political crisis, and hopefully that's going to change a little bit with the election.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of floating above all that is a climate crisis, which
Mm-hmm.
has not been getting the attention it should because it's not that immediate.
All right.
So we are experiencing this nexus of these really awful crises that are individually can overwhelm us, but collectively are really overwhelming.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. And yeah, I mean, I also like to get logically straight on this because I mean, as you mentioned, people are afraid of unpredictability and all that stuff, and essentially most people when they get hit by a crisis, they essentially run around like the proverbial headless chicken, literally or
Right.
figuratively.
Right. Well, here's the thing. So again, we're wired through evolution to deal with crises, but
Mm-hmm.
not the crises we're faced with today. Primitive crises. Let's go back in time, Alex, again, 250,000 years ago to the
Right.
Serengeti. You're faced with a crisis, and it might be you're faced with a rival tribesman with a really big club.
Mm-hmm.
And so your life is threatened, and that triggers a really essential instinct, survival instinct, and then what's called the fight or flight response, which you're
Uh-huh.
probably familiar with.
Right.
And so we have two options there. We can fight the guy with the club, or we can flee.
Uh-huh.
Now that worked then because the threat was our survival. It was immediate. The threat, you knew what it was. It was the guy with the club. It was clear and it was tangible.
Mm-hmm.
So you could take action of some sort, fighting or fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
Modern crises like the pandemic, very different. It was unforeseeable. It's
Mm-hmm.
also somewhat distant and indirect. So we can't wrap our arms around. We can't directly confront. We can't resolve the COVID crisis, whether financially or in terms of health. And also, as we've seen, it's going on now for we're approaching, I think, 9, 10 months. So the effects of this crisis are delayed and lingered. And
Uh-huh.
as I talked about before, a key thing is that's beyond our immediate control in the big sense. So
Mm-hmm.
we're wired to deal with crises, but the wrong kind of crises. And so, like you
Uh-huh.
said, Alex, we panic, we freak out, we hold up, we ignore it. That's another way these days people are dealing with the crisis. They're just ignoring it, thinking it'll just go away at some point.
Right, right.
And my basic thesis of the book is that what worked then in terms of how to deal with a crisis doesn't work now. So we need to
Mm-hmm.
approach crises in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. All right. And okay, so how differently then? I mean, these reactions, the fight or flight response, this is hardwired into us. So how else can we react to the kind of crisis we're presently facing nowadays in a way
Sure.
that's,
Well,
better, so to
yeah.
speak?
So the primitive crisis that I talked about triggers in us what I call a crisis mentality. And
Mm-hmm.
I talked about the instincts, the fight or flight, and that's all driven by a part of the brain at the base of our brain called the amygdala. And
Mm-hmm.
pretty much every animal has an amygdala. And
Mm-hmm.
its entire purpose is to filter information as fast as possible and produce an immediate reaction,
Mm-hmm.
and usually an emotional reaction,
Mm-hmm.
fear or anger. And again, fear or anger or frustration don't play well in dealing with this crisis because we can't run from it, we can't run away from it, and
Right.
we can't confront it. So what I'm suggesting is to replace the crisis mentality with what I call an opportunity mindset.
Uh-huh.
And an opportunity mindset starts with a different part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex.
Uh-huh.
You might have heard about this. It's in the front of the brain, and it's involved with what's called executive functioning.
Uh-huh.
And executive functioning involves being able to basically think through a crisis, think through a problem,
Mm-hmm.
to decisions, to weigh risk reward, to look at short-term versus long-term impact, to
Mm-hmm.
consider different options.
Mm-hmm.
And if the goal is to engage the prefrontal cortex, this opportunity mindset, which then decouples the amygdala from guiding our behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can engage that prefrontal cortex by having, first of all, a positive can-do attitude, not
Mm-hmm.
like, oh my gosh, this is the end of my life, but okay, we're in a tough situation. This is a crisis. What can we do? Being calm and purposeful, being deliberate and focused in our response.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, you mentioned a chicken with your head cut off when faced with a crisis.
Right.
Fight or flight
Right.
doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
But if we
Right.
can be calm, if we say, okay, we've got a situation here with the COVID crisis, what can we do?
Mm-hmm.
And no, Alex, we can't find a cure for COVID right now
Mm-hmm.
individually, but there are things we can do, things we can have control over. And one of the most important things we as humans can do, and I touched on this earlier, is do things that we can help us gain control of our lives.
Mm-hmm.
So simple, like wearing a mask,
Mm-hmm.
physical distancing,
Right.
not socializing,
Right.
um, following stay-at-home orders, um, also just taking care of ourselves during a crisis,
Right.
because a lot of us early on, a lot of us were shut down, and now, at least in California where we are, there are new stay-at-home orders,
Mm-hmm.
and yet we can control. We can take care of our sleep. We
Mm-hmm.
can eat well. We
Mm-hmm.
can exercise. We can do our work well. We can take care of our families. We can
Mm-hmm.
support our community as
Mm-hmm.
much as we can.
Mm-hmm.
So doing things in a very conscious and deliberate way enable us to then deal with this modern crisis, in a way that's very different from the way we would deal with a crisis back in the Serengeti 250,000 years ago.
Right, right. So this is really a totally different way of doing things. I mean, this goes against our what we're really hardwired to do. So this is a totally different approach.
It is, for sure. And in a way, we are resisting millions of years of evolution since we climbed out of the primordial muck.
Right, right.
And but fortunately, we don't have the brains of reptiles or of even normal animals or mammals.
Mm-hmm.
We have this thing on top called the cerebral cortex that separates us from animals.
Right.
And so it's a matter of using that, and we've demonstrated the ability to use that over many millennia
Mm-hmm.
to make better decisions about how we deal with the world. So
Mm-hmm.
it takes effort, but it is also very possible.
Right. Okay. Okay. So all right. So great. Okay, got that. Okay. So now onto the book. I mean, this you speak about several different strategies people can use, and I think you might have mentioned some of them earlier. But not to give everything away, but can you speak about some of
Mhm.
these other strategies that people can use?
Sure. Well, before I do that, Alex, let me first of all introduce some of the really sort of practical challenges that we face psychologically, emotionally, and in our lives.
Right.
So, first of all, we humans like routine because
Okay.
that gives us familiarity, predictability, and control. We like our daily lives, and
Right.
that's been disrupted, and so that's uncomfortable for us. Also, we've heard a lot over these last 9 months about social distancing. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, again, I'm a word guy. I wrote a blog post about this. I hate the phrase social distancing because it's not an accurate representation of what we're asked to do.
Mm-hmm.
What we're asked to do is physical distancing.
Mm-hmm.
So social distancing is really bad because isolation is really unhealthy for us psychologically and emotionally and socially.
Mm-hmm.
And so during a time when more and more we need to connect with people in a safe way,
Mm-hmm.
we're told to disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And we human beings, we need to connect. We're social beings. Plus, to solve this problem, we need to connect with others.
Right.
And also, boredom. Boredom drives generally bad behavior
Uh-huh.
because boredom is the lack of stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to do things that stimulate us. And
Mm-hmm.
that might be being on our phones too much, which again, way too much screen time during this period.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol, drugs, all really unhealthy. Now, there are some positive responses to boredom. One can exercise, one can do an online class. There are a lot of different things that we can do to overcome that boredom, but the easiest thing is to eat, drink, and sit in front of a screen.
Right.
so, so with all that said, a couple of ideas. First of all, I know this is super cliche,
Mm-hmm.
but start with a positive attitude.
Mm-hmm.
And when I talk about a positive attitude, I don't mean, oh, I'm loving this, I'm loving COVID, but see it as a challenge and not a threat.
Mm-hmm.
Because with challenges, you want to go toward the challenge and deal with the challenge head on. With
Mm-hmm.
threats, like the proverbial caveman with the really big club,
Right.
you want to run away from it. So
Uh-huh.
just starting with this idea that this is a challenge that we are facing individually and collectively.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can we deal with this in the most positive way? And so for many people, for example, who haven't been directly touched by COVID, who have maybe kept their jobs and are able to maintain themselves financially,
Right.
this has been an incredible opportunity. And I've heard this over and over again to reflect, to reset, and maybe make some changes in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Because that routine that we like, Alex, it's comfortable, it's familiar, it's easy, but it might not be exactly the life we want. But it's
Uh-huh.
really hard to change our lives when we're in a routine
Mm-hmm.
because our entire world supports that life, even though it might not be the best life that we can have or that we want.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing this as an opportunity to reflect, what kind of life do I want to lead?
Mm-hmm.
And I think remote work has really changed that. We're seeing a lot of people moving. The real estate markets in different places, especially outside the cities, are
Right.
booming. These people are looking for a different kind of life.
Mm-hmm.
So having a positive attitude, a can-do attitude is important.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing is, with a crisis, the tendency is to want to curl up in a ball on your bed, in front of your sofa, on your sofa, in front of your TV, eat ice cream, and binge watch TV shows or movies.
Right.
Not healthy.
Mm-hmm.
So what I also suggest is look for something to reignite your motivation. Find something that fires you up. And
Mm-hmm.
again, it could be exercise, it could be art, a musical instrument, reading, writing, helping the community, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Find something that can motivate you, that can get you off the sofa and get you active, either intellectually or physically.
Mm-hmm.
Really valuable because when you move, when you take action, you automatically feel better. But in the face of a threat, a crisis, the tendency is to want to withdraw from the world.
Right. Right. And that.
Um,
Go ahead. Sorry.
no, you go ahead. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
All right. Cause this like and as I said before, this is like totally different from the initial reaction of a person when faced with something like this.
Completely. So a couple other things. In a crisis, we're hit, especially this kind of perfect storm of a crisis.
Right.
We're hit with a tsunami of negative emotions:
Mm-hmm.
fear, frustration, anger, despair,
Mm-hmm.
loneliness, and and that's why we're seeing a real spike in mental health issues,
Mm-hmm.
anxiety, drug use,
Mm-hmm.
depression, etc.
Mm-hmm.
So another part of this whole taking action in this opportunity mindset is doing things that generate positive emotions,
Mm-hmm.
doing things that bring joy, excitement, pleasure, fun, satisfaction, meaning. And
Mm-hmm.
again, I've said some exercise is the biggest one for me.
Right.
But again, it can be reading, it can be writing, it can be doing art, it can be anything that generates positive emotions, because those positive emotions do two things. First of all, they turn the volume down on all those negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So you're not overwhelmed, you get a break from them.
Mm-hmm.
And also, they just make you feel good.
Mm-hmm.
Neurologically, neurochemically, physically, psychologically, emotionally, they just make you feel better. And during
Mm-hmm.
a crisis, we need to do things that make us feel better.
Mm-hmm.
Couple other things. Another, I touched on this earlier, but it's really important, is this idea of social support and connection.
Right.
That we, at an individual level and at a national level and at a global level,
Mm-hmm.
we need to connect with other people. We need to support other people
Mm-hmm.
and be supported ourselves,
Right.
because the research is very clear. One of the most robust findings in the study of stress, which
Mm-hmm.
a crisis produces, is that social support mitigates stress.
Mm-hmm.
So we feel better when we feel supported by others.
Right.
And it can be personal support, emotional support from friends and family. It
Right.
could be technical support, like listening to Dr. Fauci, or
Mm-hmm.
going online and learning about information, not misinformation, by the way.
Right.
and
Right.
and that's called technical support. So
Mm-hmm.
we can use that information to help us deal with the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So reaching out to others, again, doing it remotely, doing it safely, yes, but not shutting yourself in your house, not disconnecting from the world.
Mm-hmm.
That's adding insult to the injury of
Mm-hmm.
the pandemic.
Right. Right. Okay.
Lastly, and this is sort of a simple thing, but this is another really strong finding in the research on happiness,
Mm-hmm.
is even in these tough times, the chances are there's something to be grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
So research shows that when people express gratitude, they feel happier.
Mm-hmm.
And by the same token, the other way around, when you receive expressions of gratitude from others, you feel better too. So it's like it's
Mm-hmm.
a win-win.
Mm-hmm.
And these days, especially, there are so many people that we should be grateful for.
Mm-hmm.
The essential workers, the people who work at the supermarkets, people who work on our cars, the people who are taking out our trash. These
Right.
people are putting themselves at risk for us.
Mm-hmm.
And so anytime I see somebody working for us as an essential worker,
Mm-hmm.
I say to them, this is my little thing that I say to them, and it drives my kids nuts. But I say, hey, thanks for doing the job.
Mm-hmm.
A simple expression of gratitude makes me feel better, because I'm letting them know that I appreciate what they're doing, and what they're doing is dangerous sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes them feel better. They feel valued, because a lot of essential workers
Mm-hmm.
here in the U.S. and around the world, they're not generally considered valued people.
Mm-hmm.
The people who stock the groceries, the people who deliver packages, they are not appreciated as much as they should, and yet they are essential cogs in the wheel, who not only deserve our gratitude, but they deserve a better wage. But Alex,
Mm-hmm.
that's a whole other story.
Right. Right. Okay. All right. Okay. So very, very interesting. Very interesting. You know, it's a very interesting approach. Very different. Again, I have to say. So people love a story. People love a good story. So is there? Can you give an example where someone or an organization using such a strategy worked out well compared to, say, if they had gone with the old strategy of flight or flight?
Sure. Well, I think you can look simply at the our U.S. government's reaction to COVID.
Uh huh.
And there have been certain people, politicians, I won't name names because I don't want this to turn ideological,
Right.
who have basically buried their head in the sand
Mm-hmm.
and ignored it.
Mm-hmm.
And that has caused other people who are influenced by this person to also ignore it, which
Mm-hmm.
has made the situation worse.
Uh huh.
And so ignoring is a form of flight.
Mm-hmm.
And clearly, as we are seeing a real spike in COVID cases here in the US, it's partially been caused by certain political leadership in our country telling people basically to just ignore the suggestions, the recommendations, the mandates, the orders of the medical health field.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the one side of it. The other side is the Anthony Fauci's, and the experts who tell us there are certain things we can do to help get this crisis under control.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's a financial crisis and it's a health crisis because
Right.
our economy can't return until we've overcome this crisis.
Right.
So, so, so the experts, the medical experts, the health officials are trying to get us to use our opportunity mindset, not our crisis mentality,
Mm-hmm.
and follow some of the basic rules by engaging our prefrontal cortex, enabling us to make decisions on should we wear masks, should we go to bars and restaurants, should
Mm-hmm.
we interact with our friends and family and our extended family,
Mm-hmm.
and by asking these questions and answering yes or no, excuse me, depending upon what the suggestion is, then we are doing things to help us get out of this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And in doing so, we're not only supporting ourselves individually, we're also supporting our nation and our world collectively.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. Good example right there. All right. All right. So, Dr. Taylor, in the last few minutes of this interview or so, are there any words of wisdom you'd like to share, maybe to give our inspire listeners, give them some insight?
Sure. I think the fundamental aspect of everything I talk about with respect to crises is to look at it as an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's a silver lining in every cloud, as they say. And
Mm-hmm.
again, there have been opportunities for people in this situation to turn it into as much of a positive as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And so look at your life.
Mm-hmm.
Look at things that you might want to change
Mm-hmm.
and to then take action.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, we just had the first COVID vaccine in the UK come out, and we're supposed to be getting some in the next couple of weeks. But the reality is, the vast majority of Americans are not going to be getting the vaccine for quite a number of months. So the
Right.
crisis is going to continue.
Right.
So stay vigilant. Stay vigilant. Look for ways to make your life as good as it can, given the mandates and the orders that will continue to protect us until we all get vaccinated.
Right.
So stay vigilant. Don't let pandemic fatigue overwhelm you,
Mm-hmm.
because then you get lazy, you get sloppy, both personally and in
Mm-hmm.
terms of socially,
Right.
and then it's just going to continue to get worse. And bottom line is, yes, we're going to have a vaccine hopefully in the next 6 months for everybody, but a lot of people can die in those 6 months, and we
Right.
want to minimize that, and we don't want someone to be the last person to die before the vaccine comes out.
Right. Okay. All right. Okay. So, great words of advice right there. Great, great words right there. Okay, then. So, in closing, our guest is Dr. Jim Taylor. His book is How to Survive and Thrive When Bad Things Happen: 9 Steps to Cultivating an Opportunity Mindset in a Crisis. And you can find the book on Amazon. So, Dr. Taylor, thank you very much for being Author Story. I must say, it was very instructive being able to speak with you today.
Well, my pleasure. One very last thing, if anybody's interested in learning more about it,
Mm-hmm.
they can go to my website, drjimtaylor.com, drjimtaylor.com.
Mm-hmm.
And I also have a podcast called Crisis to Opportunity, which they can find on my website.
All right, all right. So everyone, go check that out. We will include that in the description, the blog description. All right. So everyone, go ahead and check out drjimtaylor.com as well as his book, How to Survive and Thrive When Bad Things Happen. And while you're at it, go right ahead and smash that subscribe button to listen to all the people and stories here. So catch you guys next time on Author Story, the home of authors and people with stories that matter.